So again, I can't overemphasize, if you want to host server-side code, build a SharePoint app using the app model, not a sandbox solution. But sandbox solutions are really good for declarative items only. So anything that you need to deploy into your site collection, like lists, files, that kind of stuff, content types, anything that can be done without having to go to the 15 hive, pretty much is fair game using the sandbox solution. Do work on the client. What that means is don't put server-side code in your sandbox solution because it's going to be deprecated. So it's not going to last very long. The next version of SharePoint will probably wipe that out. But if you do all your stuff client-side, you're okay. So you can get clever here and you can deploy HTML, JavaScript. And remember, you can actually deploy instances of web parts. So like a content editor web part, the web part gallery lives inside the site collection. So you could actually deploy a content editor web part that maybe has HTML in it and references to JavaScript files, and you can deploy those JavaScript files using module elements. Here you can see I have a reference to the SP services library. This is a nice project I found on Codeplex that really wraps all the web services in SharePoint really nicely. So I had to use this on a project where I was going against SharePoint 2007, so the API was really not very good, but this library actually will work on SharePoint 2007, 2010, and 2013. So it's a pretty robust library. So I made a solution using that before, and I was pretty happy with it. The other thing, you can use InfoPath a lot. So you can make no-code forms using InfoPath. Because if you use code behind in your InfoPath forms, then that requires, then you have to touch the server as well. So if you can make your InfoPath forms codeless and maybe just have them, have the forms submit to a document library, and then you can have a workflow on the document library that will do something once the InfoPath form is there, maybe parse it out and grab some of the data out of it. That's very useful as well. So for JavaScript, so I'm talking so much about doing things on the client. One way to hook in your JavaScript would be to use a custom page or a master page with script elements. You can use a custom action feature, but I don't really like that, because then that forces every single page in the whole site to execute that JavaScript, so I don't really like that. I really like this option, is using a content editor web part just with basic script elements in it. That can be provisioned very easily. You can provision and upload the JavaScript files to your site assets library. So all team sites have a site assets library, as well as the publishing sites. It's one of the main list template types in SharePoint. So highly recommend putting your JavaScript files, or you can put images there as well. Images, you may even want to decide to put, like, if you have just custom CSS only for your one little particular solution that you're building, maybe even put CSS there, or anything that your solution needs. So now we're going to take a look at deploying a JavaScript client-side sandbox solution. Okay, we're back to our Visual Studio solution now, and we're going to look at building a nice, simple client-side solution that we can deploy to SharePoint in a sandbox solution. And so this is pretty important, I think, because actually, from my experience, I worked on a project a couple months ago where I had to do this exact same thing, where I had to deploy, I wasn't allowed to deploy any server-side code to the server. It's a very large company. They didn't want anybody touching their servers, so they just made a policy that nobody could deploy anything to their servers, to their farm. And so one of the things I needed to do was get some data from a list and display it very nice and neat in a really nice, nicely formatted table. So I used a content editor web part, and I used some JavaScript libraries. I used knockout.js and datatables.net, and it made it look really nice. Did a bunch of other stuff too, but one particular page that had a report, I used that pattern. And so one of the things I did for that, in order to develop it a lot more rapidly, was I decided I would just go ahead and build what I wanted first in ASP.NET and just ignore the SharePoint data. And so let me kind of show you what that looks like here. I have a ASP.NET project here called Test Web App, and it has one page called default.html. And notice how these folders, they mimic what's in SharePoint, because we're going to create a page in the Pages library, and then publishing images. These are just all the images that come with jQuery UI and datatables.net, just the supporting images like the arrows and that kind of stuff. And then site assets represents the site assets library in SharePoint, and this is where we're going to put all of our JavaScript files and CSS files for this particular solution. And so the way this works is it's just a really simple HTML page that's loading up our JavaScript libraries here, JavaScript files and CSS files we're using Knockout, and we're using the model view model pattern in JavaScript. And you can see here the markup is really simple in the body. This will get changed in SharePoint. I'll show you that later, but for now this is good for testing. So one thing I'm doing is I'm not going against the actual data. I'm going to show you how that works in a second. But right now, this markup, I'm going against a context data. So think the context list. Think of the context list in SharePoint. That's what this is. And I have an HTML table here. I'm using datatables.net, and actually this is just using Knockout here. So I'm iterating to populate the body of the table. I'm binding to this object, this field in my view model called contacts. So that's what's getting bound to in the table, and then it's during the data binding, it's populating using the first name, last name, phone number, and email property names of my contact class, and that's set up in a contacts observable array. And so, and if there's no contacts, then this div will not be visible. So it's just doing some Knockout stuff. Now, my intention isn't to really go into Knockout or jQuery right here. There's other courses on Learn Online now that you can go into and learn that stuff. But I think it does play really nicely with SharePoint and basically doing client-side solutions in SharePoint. It makes it so you don't have to write as much code. You're just leveraging libraries that are already out there. Okay, so let's look at the view model. And then open up site assets. Here's my view model. So notice how in HTML, on the body on load is calling initialize client. And so in here in context view model, I do actually have this function initialize client here. So that's the hook. When that gets called, I create a new instance of the view model, and then here is where Knockout gets applied. We call apply bindings with Knockout, pass in the view model, and then I call activate on the view model, the activate method. And apply bindings in Knockout is basically what tells it to do all of its data binding. Based on whatever data is present, it'll do those data bindings to the HTML elements. So my context view model, the thing that's important here, well, let's just take a quick overview of this view model. So it has here's my activate function that gets called. When I call activate, all I really want to do is load up all the contacts from whatever data source, and then bind my table. That's all I care about. I just want to show that table of contacts. That's all I really want to do. So when load all contacts gets called, there's a little bit of indirection here. I call another method called get all contacts, and then when I get all the contacts, then I load up. I'm actually pushing items into that contacts observable array. So here's my contacts observable array right here. It's a Knockout observable array object. So that lets it know when you have an observable array in Knockout and when you add items to it, Knockout will automatically update the UI for it as long as you have the bindings. You've already done the bindings, you add items to an observable array, it'll populate. Just like in WPF when you have an observable collection. Same thing. Okay, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm getting, for all the contacts that I've got, I'm going ahead and pushing them onto that observable array. Now the contact class is really simple. Here it is right here. You can just see, and it has a constructor for first name, last name, phone number, email, and I just set in the constructor, I just set the properties, declare the properties for the class and set the values. So pretty simple stuff there. So get all contacts, that's where the magic happens here. Get all contacts. First I check to see, I have a view model level variable called use dummy data, and if that's true, then I use my data service to get all the contacts. Otherwise, I'm going to call a method called get all SP contacts. Here's get all SP contacts here. But first, let's look at this data service. So self.dataService, that's defined right here, and notice how it's a dummy contacts data service. And here's my dummy contacts data service, and it has a method called get all contacts, and it's just dummy data. I got an array here. I'm pushing contact objects onto that array. That's pretty simple. So that's what happens when use dummy data is true. I call that dummy data service, get all contacts method of the dummy data service. Otherwise, I call get all SP contacts. So this is interesting. Get all SP contacts. This is using the SP services library. So SP services is really interesting. This is developed by Mark Anderson with Synpraxis Consulting. It's on Codeplex, and this will work with SharePoint 2007 all the way through SharePoint 2013. And basically, it just abstracts the calls to the SharePoint web services and makes it really nice. It's a jQuery library that wraps the web services calls in SharePoint. So I happen to like it. The reason why I used it on the project I was talking about moments ago with SharePoint 2007, because this library worked on 2007, and I knew they were going to be upgrading to 2010 and then also to 2013. So I wanted my code to just work through all those upgrades without having to be changed. So that's why I used it. And so for this demo, I figured I'd just use it again since I already had some experience with it. And so you can see here, here's how you use it. You initialize it, typical jQuery syntax. I pass in the method, so right here my method is get list items. I want the contacts list. Here's my fields that I care about, so I have to pass in the camel syntax, and then I build the camel query. I just threw in there, okay, go ahead and sort by ID, just for the heck of it, just to show that. And then this part here is where when I get the data back, response XML from SharePoint, then I can iterate through and basically parse out first name, last name, phone number, and email. And then I have this contacts is defined up here in the very beginning of the method. So contacts is just an array, and I'm pushing new instances of my contact class onto the array. So I'm calling the constructor, passing in first name, last name, phone number, and email. Okay, so let's test this thing. Right now it's going to use dummy data, so I'm going to just fire this up, see what it looks like. So here's our dummy data being displayed, and you get some nice things here. I can do sorting. That's all built in for free with datatables.net. We're already bound. The data's already bound because it's using Knockout, and so this is just doing some dynamic sorting. If I had more records, I could go previous next. I don't have that. I only have 7 entries here, and we're told to show 10 entries. So anyway, that's pretty simple. This is good just to see, hey, is this working or not? Now the next step is, let's get this to work inside SharePoint. Okay, so let's go to our SharePoint site. I'm going to go to site contents. I'll add a page. I'll call it contacts demo. This is a publishing page. It's going into pages library. That's important because I want to change the layout. So I'm going to click page layout, and I want a blank web part page. so I can put a web part in there. So I'm going to add a web part, and I'll go into the media and content category. I'm actually not going to use the content editor web part, because in 2013, when you put any kind of script elements in it, it'll get stripped out. But if you use the script editor, I can put in whatever valid HTML I want, and those will stay. So I'm going to add a script editor web part. And then for my snippet, I actually have this defined already. So let me go grab my snippet. I'll paste in my snippet. So it is exactly the same HTML. The only thing different is I had to get rid of the HTML tag, the head tag. I didn't need that. I didn't need the body. What we have here is basically just a div. So at the very beginning, I have all my CSS and JavaScript references. And now this is interesting right here. This is the hook. So in the ASP.NET web project, I was using the onload event of the body tag. We don't have that in SharePoint. I don't have access to that. But in SharePoint, if you add a JavaScript function to your page called page load, SharePoint will call that for you. So I'm adding that, and I'm telling it to call initialize client. And then you can see here I replaced the body element with div, and then everything else is the same. So it's just a real basic HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and insert that, and I'm going to save my page. And actually, okay, this is interesting. I've already changed this to use SharePoint, but let me go back. Let's go into the site contents. So I'm going to edit my view model, and let me go. We'll work with this in Explorer. So I'm going to open up my contacts view model, and I'm going to tell it to use dummy data equals true. I'll save that. Okay, and let's go back to the page. Let's see, we'll go back to pages. Okay, so now we're seeing the same thing we just saw in the ASP.NET project. So there's a few things that happened here though. Remember how we had these libraries, site assets, publishing images, pages. Well, that makes sense because our page lives in the pages library. So that's fine, that's good. But then we also have publishing images and site assets where all of our JavaScript lives, and the images that jQuery UI and datatables.net are using. So I've actually already uploaded those to the site. So if I go to site assets, you'll see here's all of my JavaScript files and the CSS files I'm using. There's the jQuery UI CSS, the jQuery datatable CSS, and the associated JavaScript. So that's all in there. And then also I have images. The URL for images is actually publishing images. You can see here publishing images. And I've uploaded all the same images in here. I just went into Explorer view and uploaded them. That was pretty simple. Okay, so let's go back. So I also created the contacts list. So I based it off of the contacts list template. I created a list based off that, out of the box contacts list template, and I just added a record. So here's my record. So if I go back, just to make sure everything is legitimate here. So we're getting dummy data right now, and we can actually prove that. If I go, I'm going to open up Fiddler, And just make sure we're not making any web service calls or anything. So I'm going to refresh the page. And notice how there are no web service calls. You don't see any underscore VTI bin URLs here. It's just grabbing stuff out of the site assets library, so that's fine. Close that out. Now let's go back to the assets library. Do I still have that open? I do have it open. Okay, so I'll open it from here because we still have that map drive, or mapped. We still have the mapping. We have it in Explorer view. So I'll set this to false. Save that. Okay, now, actually I'm just going to close that. Alright, so now if I go back to my page, I click here, I should just see whatever's in the list, and that this is what's in the list. And we can prove that by going to Fiddler, and if I refresh the page, here's my web service call right here, and you can see I'm calling get list items right here, list name contacts. That's my query. There's my v fields that I'm sending in, and let's look at the XML coming back. Here's the result. Item count 1. There's my last name, first name, phone, email. So that's legitimate. So the next thing would be, now we have this working. That was the main thing. Get this tested, get this working. We could actually stop here if we wanted to, and in fact, sometimes that's something that people do all the time. But we could also package this up. And so if we wanted to package it up, basically what we would do would be we would take the script editor web part. So let me go to edit the page. And I could go to edit the web part. And if I want to, I could export it. So just exporting that web part would create an XML file, and then I could save that, and then I could put that into my solution if I wanted to. Also, what I could do, let me get out of here. Let me just cancel out of here. Yeah, so if we wanted to do that, we could. I'm not going to do that though, but that would be one way of doing it. And all of our files, the site assets and publishing images, these could all go into a feature. So I would actually add a module for each one, add a module for site assets and a module for publishing images. And then I would basically provision all these files through my module, and then it would be inside the feature. So when the feature is activated, it would provision all these files into SharePoint. And then the same thing with the list. I could do the same thing. We could create, the last demo you saw, we created a custom list. In fact, here's our last demos right here. We created this custom list, and it was in this feature right here. So we could do the same thing. We could provision that all inside this sandbox project. I'm not going to do that right now because that takes some time to put all that stuff in there, but that's definitely something that you could do. And the main idea is we just build a little solution here that's actually fairly sophisticated using JavaScript. It doesn't require any server-side code, and we can wrap it all up into a sandbox solution, so we can provision all these files. We don't have any executing code as far as server-side code in our sandbox solution. We're just provisioning files. That's all we're doing. We're just provisioning those files. We're provisioning JavaScript files, and we're provisioning CSS and all these images. And then we also can provision an instance of our web part, because the web part gallery is just a list in SharePoint, and so you can provision the .web part file into SharePoint without any code. We export the web part, and then we would just in fact, that would be pretty easy. We could do something where we say add new item, and then we could say web part 1, and then the web part, we would get rid of CSS. We don't need that. We would keep the elements because we want this to be deployed. We would want this to be deployed to the web part gallery. So it would go here, and here's our file, our .web part file, and then all we would do is replace what's in the .web part file with whatever we exported from the site. So if we exported a web part from the site, we could take all that data, put it into a .web part file here, and then we could provision that configured web part, with all of that code snippet that we put in. We could provision that. So that's how you do it. I'm just going to delete that out. So you have a really nice way of provisioning client-side JavaScript code that's using SharePoint Web Services and nicely wrapped into a sandbox solution. So you could basically take that solution from site collection to site collection and not have to configure too much. You would just upload the solution, activate it, and then you could even provision the page if you wanted to. So there's a lot that you can do there, and it's the basic premise here is using client-side JavaScript going against SharePoint Web Services wrapped up in a sandbox solution, provisioning files only, no server-side code.